G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session 30 in the book of Jeremiah. We're looking today at chapter 46, verse 20, down to 48, verse 17. In this section here and in the last session, we saw that Jeremiah is now prophesying against the nations. He starts with Egypt, and he's going to work his way from Egypt across to the east, right across to Moab. Egypt, again, he prophesied that Egypt are going to be defeated by the Babylonians at Carchemish. Remember, at that particular time, Egypt was an ally of the Assyrians, and Egypt marched to the Assyrians' aid against the Babylonians at Carchemish. But they got there a little bit too late, even though they thought they could defeat the Babylonians, simply because of their numerical superiority. Egypt were defeated at Carchemish. And God was in total control of this defeat. This was part and parcel of his plan and purpose. And this defeat of Egypt in Carchemish now actually removed the last obstacle preventing Babylon from becoming a first-rate worldwide empire. Jeremiah then prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, would now move down and come against Egypt and strike Egypt. And so remember that the Jews had fled from Judah down into Egypt to try and escape Nebuchadnezzar's sacking of Judah. They'd fled down to Migdol, Memphis and Panhes in Egypt for safety, and Jeremiah now prophesies to them, and he now warns them to prepare for captivity. All that they succeeded in doing was having a longer walk from Egypt back to Babylon than if they'd remained in the land and been taken captive in the land of Judah. Okay, so now we're coming to this session this week, and we're looking here at the second prophecy, which is the conquest of Egypt here, and we're still in this section. See the second strophe, and the second strophe here encompasses verses 20 to 26 of chapter 46. It further describes the destruction of Egypt. Verse 20 announces this destruction. Egypt is a very fair heifer, but destruction out of the north is come, it is come. So the land of Egypt here is likened to a pretty heifer, which is a young female cow, about to be slaughtered. Jeremiah used a very unique Hebrew term for destruction here. It's the term keretz, and the meaning of this word is a little bit dubious. It may be nipping, just nipping away. In fact, the New American Standard Bible translates it as horsefly, and the JPS rendered it as gadfly. So if this is what it's meant here, it means the picture here with this lovely little fair heifer, the picture is that of a large fly that stings cattle, leaving a wound. So this pretty and healthy heifer, Egypt, would be attacked and severely wounded by a horsefly. Now, and that horsefly would be Babylon. Now, twice Jeremiah wrote that this attack would come, and so he was emphasizing the certainty of the Babylonian invasion from the north. He says, out of the north is come, it is come. He's simply emphasizing it's going to happen. Now, verse 21 shows that Egypt's mercenaries would prove useless in the hour of danger. It says in verse 21, also her hired men in the midst of her are like calves of the stall, for they also are turned back, they're fled away together. They did not stand. For the day of their calamities come upon them, the time of their visitation. So again, staying with the image here of agriculture that was first introduced in verse 20, Jeremiah likened Egypt's mercenaries to fattened calves, and fattened calves are ready for slaughter. They would prove useless in saving Egypt from invasion. And the reason is that the time of their punishment had come. Therefore, they would flee instead of standing their ground. It's exactly what they did. Now, this, in verses 22 to 23, Jeremiah describes the devastation of the land itself. The sound thereof shall go like the serpent, for they shall march with an army and come against her with axes as hewers of wood. They shall cut down her forests, says Jehovah, though it cannot be searched, because they are more than the locust and are innumerable. So in verse 22, he describes the approach of the Babylonians. The sound thereof shall go like a serpent. Now, a serpent's very quiet, but when a snake approaches its prey, it slithers back and forth towards its destination. And that's what we're seeing here. The army of the Babylonians will weave back and forth like a serpent, and they're going to descend upon Egypt in the same manner and strike. For they shall march like an army. They shall come against her with axes as hewers of wood. Jeremiah is giving us a picture here of the Babylonians. They're going to defeat Egypt. It'd be so easy. It'd be just like chopping wood. That's how easy it's going to be. It'll take a little bit of extra work, be a little bit strenuous, but it'll come out as surely and as easily as simply chopping wood. And then verse 23 describes the devastation itself. They shall cut down her forest, says Jehovah, though it cannot be searched. The picture here is that even though the vast, massive Egyptian population was like a thick forest, a forest that because of its vast thickness and size cannot be searched out, it's just, the population was so huge. Although Egypt may be like that, nevertheless, it's going to be defeated. And because there are more than the locusts and are innumerable. So even the mass of people is not going to hinder Babylon from cutting the country to shreds, which is exactly what they did. Yeah. Verse 24, we see the fall of Egypt. The daughter of Egypt shall be put to shame. She shall be delivered into the hand of the people of the north. Now, the daughter of Egypt, this is referring to the Egyptian population. Back in verse 19, in the last session, he mentioned the daughter that dwelled in Egypt. That was different. This time he mentions a daughter of Egypt, and this is the normal expression, the daughter of Egypt, which refers to the Egyptian population. So they would be brought to shame and delivered into the hands of the people of the north. Now, we know from previous Jeremiah prophecies and also from history that the people of the north are the Babylonians. They come down from the north. And then verses 25 and the first part of verse 26 describe the punishment of Egypt's gods and kings. In verse 25, Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, says, behold, I will punish Ammon of No, and Pharaoh and Egypt with her gods and her kings, even Pharaoh and them that trust in him. Now, punishment was now declared by Jehovah, the one true God, and it's going to come upon Ammon. Now, Ammon is the god of No, okay? No is a place. Ammon, also known as Amun or Ammon double N or Amun-Ra, was the Egyptian god of the sun and air. He was one of the most important gods of ancient Egypt and rose to prominence in the 16th century BC. He was a chief god of No. No is it's Thebes, and that was the capital of Upper Egypt. The third, what we're going to see also here now is that in the previous verses, the focus was primarily on Memphis in the north of the country. However, as this verse now shows, Nebuchadnezzar would now not be satisfied with the defeat of the lower Egypt. He's going to come for the entire country. So the punishment would also come upon all other Egyptian gods, as well as Pharaoh and his government. And after it says, and afterwards it shall be inhabited as in the days of old, says Jehovah. Okay, so what we see, Pharaoh is also going to be punished. Third, Egypt will be punished. God promised to punish the land of Egypt. He promised to punish both her gods and her kings. So he'll punish Pharaoh, and especially those who trust Pharaoh to protect them. And in verse 26, he describes the punishment, and I will deliver them into the hand of those that seek their lives, and into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of his servants. So God is going to deliver them into the hands of those who seek their lives. And the entire Egyptian population will be handed over to the Babylonians, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar and his servants. And that is the work of God. Now, in the second part of verse 26, and afterwards it shall be inhabited as in the days of old, says Jehovah. So what is he saying here? Isaiah 19 and also Ezekiel 29, both of those prophets prophesied or promised prophesied that Egypt's devastation will not be a total destruction. In the second part of verse 26, there's a promise of future restoration of the Egyptians. It says, afterwards it will be inhabited as in the days of old. So Egypt has a positive future in the kingdom. And this is in the millennial or messianic kingdom. In Isaiah 19, verses 19 to 25, we read of the fact that there'll be a national regeneration of Egypt, as there will be a national regeneration of the people of Israel. And then in Ezekiel, another prophet, Ezekiel 29, 30 to 16, it says that even though Egypt will be nationally converted, because of their long-standing animosity to the Jews, this cannot be so easily erased. So what will happen? For the first 40 years of the 1,000-year Messianic kingdom, the Egyptians will be dispersed all over the world. And the land of Egypt will lie desolate without inhabitant for a period of 40 years. Ezekiel 29, 13 to 16 tells us this. So for the first 40 years of the Messianic kingdom, the land of Egypt will lie desolate. And after the 40 years of dispersion, in which the Egyptians will experience what it was like for the Jews to be dispersed, then all of the Egyptians will be regathered and brought back into the land of Egypt, and Egypt will again be inhabited. Egypt is going to be a kingdom in the millennial or messianic kingdom. Zechariah 14, 16 to 19 points out that Egypt will be one of the nations that each year after that will send a delegation to Jerusalem for the observance of the Feast of Tabernacles. Remember, Feast of Tabernacles is one of those feasts you have to celebrate in the kingdom. Now, we see the comfort of Israel here in 46 verses 27 to 28. And so 46 now ends with a word of comfort to Israel. Verse 27 and 28. But fear not you, O Jacob, my servant, neither be dismayed, O Israel. For lo, I will save you from afar, and your seed from the land of their captivity. And Jacob shall return, and shall be quiet and at ease, and none shall make him afraid. Fear not you, O Jacob, my servant, says Jehovah, for I am with you, for I'll make a full end of all the nations whither I have driven you. But I will not make a full end of you, but I will correct you in measure, and will in no wise leave you unpunished. So the judgment of Egypt, the judgment against Egypt, ends with a third prophecy in this chapter. And this prophecy deals with the nation of Israel. In verse 27, he declares that Israel is going to be restored. He begins with a command, do not fear, O my servant Jacob, neither be dismayed, O Israel. Now, the reason here is that God will save them from afar. He will save them from the land of their captivity. It's a prophecy here that Jacob, or Israel, will once again return into her land. Once again, we see Jeremiah using the word shuv, S-H-U-V, which is his favorite word in his book. And the way he uses it there is that Israel will return back to the land. So Israel is going to have a regathering, and the Jews will be returned to their own land in totality. Also, Jacob shall be quiet. What does that mean? Well, it means that they're going to live in peace. Also, Jacob shall be at ease, meaning that they'd live comfortably and luxuriously with no one making them tremble anymore. There'll be no more war, no more persecution, no more devastation. And then verses 27 and 28. These verses 27 and 28 are very similar to Jeremiah 30, verses 10 and 11. So this prophecy we see here, where Israel will be restored with all of these blessings, this prophecy is going to be fulfilled in the millennial or messianic kingdom. Now, verse 28, fear not you, O Jacob, my servant, says Jehovah, for I am with you. For I'll make a full end of all the nations whither I've driven you. But I'll not make a full end of you, but I'll correct you in measure, and it will in no wise leave you unpunished there. So not only will Israel be restored, but Israel will be restored because she will survive. Now, as in verse 27. So verse 28 also begins with a command. Fear you not, O Jacob, my servant. Again, reasons are given why Israel should not fear. First of all, because God is with them. He will make certain that they will survive. Second, he'll make a full end of all the nations to which he has driven them, but he will not make a full end of Israel. God does not promise a survival of many of the nations among whom the Jews are scattered, but he does promise the survival of Israel. He does promise survival for some of the nations among whom they are driven, but not all of them. And the promise here is that God will not make a full end of the Jews. And the principle that God uses is the principle of divine judgment, which in this case is actually divine discipline. God's judgment is judgment unto itself, but disciplinary judgment is a judgment that has repentance for its end. Disciplinary judgment is done to cause the nation or the individual to turn back to God. So the principle is, first, God will correct them in measure. This is Israel. So if Israel sins, God will bring on punishment. Second, God will in no way leave her unpunished. Israel will be punished, but notice that punishment or discipline is always in measure. There'll be a measured judgment, and the judgment will be limited. There may be great devastation, but it will never be total. And this is a repetition of Jeremiah 30, verse 11. So verse 27 was Jeremiah 30, verse 10. Verse 28 is Jeremiah 30, verse 11. And he places it here in light of the fact that the Jews fled to Egypt and that there will be future devastation among the Jews in Egypt, which is found in Jeremiah chapters 44 and 46. And the promise here is that they too will eventually survive. Chapter 47, which we're going to go now, verses 1 to 7, deal with the next nation, which is the nation of the Philistines. Now, it's only a very short chapter, it's only 7 verses. With its 7 verses, Jeremiah 47 is the shortest chapter in the book of Jeremiah. Verse 1 simply serves as a superscription and it introduces the topic. Verses 2 to 4, they prophesy the invasion of Philistia, and verses 5 to 7 discuss the devouring sword. A bit of a summary of the history of the Philistines here. The Philistines inhabited the land southwest of Israel along the Mediterranean Sea, from the Yarkon River in the north to Raphia in the south. In the Hebrew Bible, we see him mentioned in the Table of Nations back in Genesis 10:14. And according to Deuteronomy 2:23 and Jeremiah 47:4 and Amos 9:7, the Philistines came from Caphtor, Caphtor, which is a Hebrew name for Crete, the island of Crete. So at one point, the Philistines crossed the Aegean and Mediterranean seas to migrate to the coast of Canaan. This migration led to the designation of the Philistines as sea peoples, because they came by sea. In Canaan, the Philistines had contact with Abraham and Isaac back around about 2000 BC. And during the time of Samuel and Samson in the 13th century, Philistines moved inland from the coast of Canaan, and there they founded the 5 cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron, which we find in Joshua 13:3. These cities were each ruled by a king, we know from the scripture reading. But even though each city had its own king, when they were threatened, they all came together in times of national crisis. Now, from the very beginning, the Philistines were either allies or mortal enemies of the Israelites, and each of their 3 gods, you remember, Dagon was one, Ashtaroth another, and Baal-zebub was also another. they all had worship centers in different cities. The Philistine soldiers used to carry their gods in front of them when they went into battle. And we see that the fact is, if you read 1 Samuel 5, 1 to 12, you see that they revered Israel's Ark of the Covenant. It does mean that they actually added Jehovah of Israel to their pantheon of gods. So to the Israelites, the Philistines were simply the uncircumcised. They had no relationship with the one true God. Now, events described in chapter 47 provide context for the events described in Jeremiah 36, right? I know we're in chapter 47, but this is describing the events. It gives the context for the events in chapter 36. Remember, Jeremiah did not write his book in chronological order, but it was based on themes in Jeremiah, and the thematic development in chapters 46 to 51 is his prophecy against the Gentile nations. Okay, the topic, in verse 1, the word of Jehovah that came to Jeremiah the prophet concerning the Philistines before that Pharaoh smote Gaza. So the topic here is the word of Jehovah, the Philistines, the subject of the prophecies here. We see in Isaiah 14, 28 to 31, Isaiah prophesies the Philistines. Ezekiel 25, 15 to 17, we see them then at the bottom of that slide. Amos 1, 6 to 8, Zephaniah 2, 4 to 7, Zechariah 9, 5 to 7. Now, Jeremiah now adds his prophecies to these 5 other prophecies concerning the Philistines. And the time of this prophecy came before Pharaoh of Egypt smote Gaza. So we have 2 possible dates here. First, the year 609 BC, this was the battle which came before the Battle of Megiddo, when good King Josiah was killed by Pharaoh Necho. So that's in 609. Remember, Josiah was a good king in Judah, killed by Pharaoh Necho, and at that point, the Egyptians were now on their way to Haran to try and help the Assyrians against the Babylonians. The second date is the year 605 BC, and this is after they were smitten at Carchemish by the Babylonians, in fulfillment of Jeremiah 46, 2 to 12. On his way back to Egypt, Pharaoh took out his vengeance upon the town of Gaza. Now, one thing we do know is that the events of verse 1 had to take place before 604 BC, because in 604 BC, Gaza was smitten, sacked, and deported by Nebuchadnezzar. So this prophecy took place either in 609 or 605. We don't know the exact date, but we know it had to come before 604 BC, when Egypt was defeated and exiled by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. Now, the invasion here of Philistia, verses 2 to 4. Thus says Jehovah, behold, waters rise up out of the north and shall become an overflowing stream, and shall overflow the land and all that is therein, the city and them that dwell therein. And the men shall cry, and all the inhabitants of the land shall wail, at the noise of the stamping of the hoofs of his strong ones, at the rushing of his chariots, at the rumbling of his wheels. The fathers look not back to their children for feebleness of hands, because of the day that cometh to destroy all the Philistines, to cut off from Tyre and Sidon every helper that remains. For Jehovah will destroy the Philistines, the remnant of the Isle of Capthor. So Jeremiah is describing the invasion of the Philistine plain, or the land of Philistia. Verse 2 describes the invasion itself. He uses the figure of a flood. Now, you may recall that whenever the figure of a flood is used symbolically in Scripture, it is always a symbol of a military invasion. The picture is of a flood waters arising from the north and overflowing its banks. And this water from the north is Babylon. It's the Babylonian Empire, Babylonian armies coming down. Nebuchadnezzar with his armies is coming out of Babylon toward the land of the Philistines. And the Babylonian army is pictured as suddenly coming as an overflowing stream They shall overflow the land and all that is therein. So the city and those therein shall be drowned in this invasion. And the results are, first of all, the men shall cry. Second, all the inhabitants of the land shall wail. Now, verse 3 records the noise of battle, the noise of the stamping of the hoofs of his strong ones, of the rushing of his chariots, rumbling of his wheels. The fathers looked not back to their children for feebleness of hands. What's he saying here? Well, Jeremiah is using various descriptions of an army in action here. And he, as you can see, he's concentrating primarily on the noise such an army makes. Galloping hooves, rushing of chariots, rumbling of wheels. The Babylonian invasion would be so swift and fierce that the Philistines would turn and run. There was such panic and flight that the fathers do not even look back for the children. Their hands have become feeble. They became so terrorized by the onslaught of the Babylonian armies that they abandoned their own children to the invading armies of the Babylonians. They didn't even look back. They just ran. And in verse 4, because of the day that comes to destroy all the Philistines, to cut off from Tyre and Sidon every helper that remains, for Jehovah will destroy the Philistines, the remnant of the Isle of Capthor. Now, this is all a result of the judgment of God. The day has come to destroy all the Philistines, and as a result of the Babylonian destruction of Philistia, only a small remnant of the Philistines survived. Now, eventually, the Philistines disappeared. Also, the cities allied with the Philistines were cut off in such a way that they couldn't provide any help either. That was Tyre and Sidon. They were the allies of the Philistines. The allies of the Philistines, they proved totally useless. They were cut off. And the reason for their uselessness is that the driving force behind the Babylonian invasion was Jehovah himself. He set out to destroy Philistia. God's decree was to destroy the Philistines and the remnant of the island of Capthor, which is Crete, which we saw earlier. Now, when the Babylonians were finished with the Philistines, only a small remnant survived. In fact, Zechariah 9, verse 7, mentions this small remnant of the Philistines that was left. Zechariah 9, verse 7. You see the devouring sword in verses 5 to 7 of 46. And this is where this chapter ends here. Now, in 5 to 7, Jeremiah foresaw the destruction of 2 Philistine cities that represented the nation's remaining strength. And this destruction led to the expression of grief described in verse 5. Baldness has come upon Gaza. Ashkelon is brought to naught, the remnant of their valley. How long will you cut yourself? So, lamentation here is described by the reaction of 3 groups. 3 groups. Now, first, concerning the city of Gaza, baldness has come upon them. What does that mean? Well, it means that the men of Gaza have shaved themselves as a sign of mourning. Second, Ashkelon has come to nothing. Now, these are all up north. Well, one was down the southern part and one was at the northern part. As for the remnant left in the valley, how long will you cut yourself? So here again, what it means here is that they're cutting themselves as a sign of mourning. Cast your mind back to chapter 41. In chapter 41 of Jeremiah, we see the 80 men who Ishmael killed. Remember, Ishmael was that devious one. He killed these 80 men. These had also cut themselves in mourning as well. So we see it back in chapter 41, verse 5. Now, in verse 6, a question is asked. O you sword of Jehovah, how long will it be ere you be quiet? Put up yourself into your scabbard, rest and be still. What he's saying here is, can the sword of Jehovah be still? How long until you're quiet? Question is, how long can the sword of Jehovah continue to slash away? How long would it take for the invasion to end and for the sword to be quiet again? That's what he's asking here. And now, verse 7, how canst you be quiet, seeing Jehovah has given you a charge? Against Ashkelon and against the seashore, there hath he appointed it. So the answer to this question now, how long? Well, the answer to this question comes in verse 7. How can you be quiet seeing Jehovah has given you a charge? Against Ashkelon, against the seashore, he's appointed it. So the sword is only going to be put away when it had fulfilled its mission. So how can he be quiet seeing the Lord has given it a charge? Well, how can it cease from doing the mission as long as the mission has been spelled out by God himself? The charge has been, first of all, against Ashkelon. Second, it's been against the sea coast, or better, against a coastal plain. This is where the Philistines were. The Philistines settled in the southern coastal plain of the land of Israel, and there God appointed the sword against them. So the prophecies of Jeremiah 47 against the Philistines reached their fulfillment in 604, 603 BC. Actually, the events here of chapter 47 serve as the background for Jeremiah 36. All right, remember again, Jeremiah was not written on the basis of chronological sequence, but on the basis of thematic developments. And the thematic development was this prophecy against the Gentile nations. So chapter 47 is the background to chapter 36. Now we come to another Gentile nation, and this next prophecy regards the nation of Moab. This is Israel's neighbor to the east on the other side of the Jordan River. Moab is nowadays inside central Jordan. Now, where did Moab come from? Well, Moab, the origins of Moab we find back in Genesis 19, verses 30 to 38. Genesis 19, 30 to 38. Remember, Lot and his daughters, after escaping Sodom, Lot and his daughters, they stayed in a cave in the hills near a place called Zoar, Z-O-A-R. And when Lot was drunk, his daughters seduced him, and both of them conceived and gave birth to children. The eldest daughter of Lot named her son Moab, and he became the father of the Moabites, which is where we're dealing with here. And the younger daughter named her son Ben-Ami, and from him descended the Ammonites. So the Moabites, the Ammonites, they're descendants of Lot through the incestuous relationship with his daughter. Now, according to Jeremiah 48, verses 1 to 47, a day would come when Moab suffers destruction. However, just as it was in the case with Egypt, Jeremiah also prophesied that this destruction would not be total. He says those who survive the terror of judgment would actually come to repentance, and a remnant of Moab would then return and be saved. As we're going to see, the prophecy against Moab will be fulfilled during the tribulation and in the Messianic kingdom. The destruction of Moab we see in verses 1 to 10. In verses 1 to 10, we'll just read that just quickly here for you. Of Moab, this is the prophecy. Of Moab, thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, woe unto Nebo, for it is laid waste. Kiriathaim is put to shame, it is taken. Misgab is put to shame and broken down. The praise of Moab is no more. In Heshbon they have devised evil against her. Come and let us cut her off from being a nation. You also, O madmen, shall be brought, Madmen is a city, you also, O madmen, shall be brought to silence. The sword shall pursue you. The sound of a cry from Horonaim, desolation and great destruction. Moab is destroyed. Her little ones have caused a cry to be heard. For by the ascent of Luith, with continual weeping shall they go up. For at the descent of Horonaim they have heard the distress of the cry of destruction. Flee, save yourselves, and be like the heath in the wilderness. For because you have trusted in your works and in your treasures, you also shall be taken. And Chemosh, which is their God, shall go forth into captivity, his priests and his princes together. And the destroyer shall come upon every city, and no city shall escape. The valley also shall perish, and the plain shall be destroyed, as Jehovah has spoken. Give wings unto Moab, that she may fly and get her away, and her cities shall become a desolation without any to dwell therein. Cursed be he that does the work of Jehovah negligently, and cursed be he that keeps his sword from blood. So in dealing with Moab here, the first 10 verses are a description of the destruction of Moab. The topic here is of Moab. Moab is also the subject of other prophecies, who are other prophets who gave both near and far prophecies. And some of the prophets actually spent quite a bit of time dealing with Moab. The most obvious of these is Isaiah 15:1 to 16:14. Isaiah spends 2 whole chapters dealing with Moab. And then we have Ezekiel in Ezekiel 25 verses 8 to 11, and then Amos in Amos 2:1 to 3, and then Zephaniah in chapter 2 verses 8 to 11. So these other prophets spend quite a bit of time on Moab as well. Now in verses 1c to 6, the third part of verse 1, the cities which are under judgment are now spelled out. First of all, Nebo is mentioned. Woe unto Nebo, is laid waste. Well, Nebo was originally given to the tribe of Reuben back in Numbers 32. However, by the time of Jeremiah's day, the Moabites had regained control of the city of Nebo. In fact, Nebo, if you cast your mind right back into Deuteronomy, Nebo was near the spot where Moses died. That's in Deuteronomy 34, verses 1 to 6. The other city is Kiriathaim. That's also a city of the tribe of Reuben. It's also by Jeremiah's time become a purely Moabite city and not a Reubenite city. And the fact here that the future conquest of Kiriathaim would put the city to shame may indicate that it will be a very strong fortified city once again in the future. And then we have another one called Misgab. It is put to shame and broken down. The Hebrew term Misgav means a secure height or a retreat or a stronghold. So that's why it's put to shame, because it's torn down from that position. Okay, now, next city is Heshbon in verse 2. The praise of Moab is no more. In Heshbon they have devised evil against her. Come, let us cut her off from being a nation. Hebrew term for devised here, the name Heshbon comes from the same root word. A bit of a word play here in this verse. If the word play would be, in the plot house they have plotted evil. The word for devised is, and the word for Heshbon, in plot house they've plotted evil. So it's a bit of a word play. Now, at one point, Heshbon was the capital of the Amorite kingdom under Sihon. Sihon was defeated by Moses, and then again this city was given to the tribe of Reuben. However, in Jeremiah's day, Heshbon belonged to the Moabites. So the prophecy against Heshbon foreshadows the formation of a conspiracy against the city. And the plan involved in this conspiracy here against Heshbon was to come and cut her off from being a nation. So the conspiracy was to the extent that they were to be so totally cut off that it would no longer be an independent city-state, and Moab would no longer be a country. And this conspiracy, to some degree, has enjoyed God's divine sanction. Yet, as we're going to see, there will be a word of hope at the very end. While the picture here will be one of continuous massive desolation and destruction, it will contain a little ray of hope for Heshbon. And then second part of verse 2 mentions Madmen. It's another town. It's not people. It's another town of Moab. You also, O madmen, shall be brought to silence. The sword shall pursue you. Here we have another little bit of a word play in Hebrew, because the name madmen and the term for brought to silence sound very similar. So the word play may be reproduced in English. Silent ones, you will be silenced. Or you shall become still, O still house. So that's another word play. Anyway, whatever it is, the emphasis is that this Moabite town would be stunned into silence. In fact, we don't even see the name of this town again in scriptures. Madmen. Now, another one is Horonaim. the sound of a cry from Horonaim, and the cry coming from this city will contain desolation and destruction. So the content of the cry is that Moab will experience desolation and massive destruction. And then in verses 4 to 5, he points out that Moab is destroyed. Her little ones have caused a cry to be heard. For by the ascent of Luhith, with continual weeping shall they go up. For the descent of Horonaim, they have heard the distress of the cry of destruction. Now, Jeremiah now turns his attention to the children of the Moabites. And because of the massive devastation, the children will also lift up a cry in verse 4. In verse 5, he mentions here the ascent of Luhith, where they go up with continual weeping. And the picture here is that they're seeking higher ground. And so they're going upwards from where they were down there in Moab. And here we have a weeping because what they've done is they've just left behind the city which is being destroyed. And in the second part of this verse, in verse 5, he mentions the descent of Horonaim. So having reached the top, going up Luhith, they must then go down the other side. So the picture is that as they go up by the ascent of Luhith, they weep as they go up because behind them their possessions are being destroyed. And as they're over the hill and going down the ascent of Horonaim, in the background, they hear the noise of destruction. Similar thing is found in Isaiah 15, verse 5. Isaiah 15, verse 5. And then in verse 6, a bit of a rhetorical question or a bit of a rhetorical command. Jeremiah issued a command to flee. Flee, save yourselves, and be like the heath in the wilderness. What he's saying is, make a run for it. Get out of there. And then in verse 7, after giving these 6 verses of judgment, he then gives the reasons for the judgment. For because you have trusted in your works and in your treasures, you also shall be taken. And Chemosh shall go forth into captivity, his priests and his princes together. So the reason for the judgment is that they trusted in themselves in the 3 specific areas. First of all, they trusted in their own good works or in their own works. Second, they trusted in their own wealth. We're wealthy, we'll be okay. Third, they trusted in their own God, Chemosh. Now, because they trusted in their own personal works and their personal wealth and in their own God, Chemosh, judgment came. And the judgment is that because of her sins in words and deeds and thinking or worship, they will be taken. Because of their trust in Chemosh, their strange God, they're going to go into captivity. The idol, Chemosh, shall go into captivity. His pride, his priests, and his princes shall also go into captivity together. Then in verses 8 to 10 is the description of the judgment. First, we see the totality of the destruction in verse 8. And the destroyer shall come upon every city, and no city shall escape, and no city shall escape. Now, no cities within the nation of Moab will not suffer this type of destruction. He says in verse 8, the valley also shall perish, and the plain shall be destroyed, as Jehovah has spoken. So not one city in Moab would escape devastation. Even the valleys and the plateaus of the nation would be destroyed. The guarantee that this prophecy would come to pass is that Jehovah's decrees of judgment must be fulfilled. God's word will not be unfulfilled. Now, second, he deals with the flight of Moab in verse 9. Give wings unto Moab that she may fly and get her away, and her cities shall become a desolation without any to dwell therein. So as the cities are being destroyed, the population will run. The picture is that wings will be given to the Moabites so they can successfully flee. And the result of the flight will be that her cities will become desolate without any dwelling therein. And the picture here is that there will be such great devastation that as far as the cities are concerned, there will be no inhabitant. And third, Jeremiah issues an admonition to the destroyers in verse 10. Jeremiah says 2 things in his admonition to the destroyers. In verse 10, first of all, cursed be he that does the work of Jehovah negligently. So the work of Jehovah in this chapter is the destruction of the land of Moab. So those whom God has assigned to destroy the Moabites, which in this particular instance is primarily the Babylonians and later on others who followed them, are to destroy and to destroy with full speed. They must be very diligent in their work of destruction. They must not be negligent in their work of destroying. If they become negligent in God's decree of destroying Moab, then they themselves will be cursed. And second, cursed be he that keeps back his sword from blood. So this is a personal message to the individual soldiers. Each individual soldier who opted to restrain his sword from blood would be cursed. And the soldier must continue to swing with the sword and swing with the sword. The reason for this curse is that these human destroyers of Moab were fulfilling a role in God's judgment on that nation, and therefore they're to do it with full gusto. And in verses 11 to 17, we see the complacency of Moab. Verses 1 to 10 dealt with the destruction, and now we deal with the complacency. And part of their complacency actually helped bring about the divine decree of judgment. Now, verse 11 describes Moab's personal self-confidence. Moab has been at ease from his youth, and he has settled on his lees, and has not been emptied from vessel to vessel, neither has he gone into captivity. Therefore his taste remains in him, and his scent is not changed. So, what does this all mean? Moab has been at ease from his youth. Now, while Moab has been invaded and occupied for a short time, throughout most of her history, she has been free. And in this passage, the emphasis is that Moab has never been sent into captivity. Moab has been invaded. She has even been occupied. And for a period of time, the world was controlled by the United Kingdom of Israel and later by the Northern Kingdom of Israel. So this is when she was occupied. In those two situations, Moab was invaded and occupied by Israel and then by Northern Kingdom of Israel. However, Moab was never at any time sent into captivity. And the picture is that Moab has settled upon his lees. And in this figure, Moab is compared to some vintage wine, which has been allowed to settle on its dregs. If vintage wine stays too long on its lees or sediment, it turns to syrup, it loses the quality of good wine. So Moab is like a good vintage wine, which was allowed to settle on its lees, and it became sugary and syrupy. It has not been emptied from vessel to vessel, or if you're a wine expert, it has not been decanted from bottle to bottle. Wine was decanted from bottle to bottle. It would cause the wine to age and mature slowly, making it nice and smooth. And this would improve its flavor. So the picture here of Moab is not as wine, which has been poured from bottle to bottle and become enriched and better tasting. Rather, it is like wine, which has been allowed to settle on its lees and become syrupy. The entire picture of verse 11 is one of complacency. In Isaiah 16, 8-11, Moab was famous for its vineyards. The prophet Isaiah spoke of the pride of Moab. The things which Moab, that's what we see here, is the things which Moab were prideful for were the fact of its vintage wine. And then the verse ends with the result. Therefore, in light of what has been said in verse 11, therefore his taste remained in him and his scent has not changed. The taste was not improved. The smell of the wine was not improved. Moab remained in a very complacent state. And now, in light of Moab's complacency and self-confidence, verses 12 to 17 deal with the judgment itself. Now, concerning the judgment, Jeremiah says, first of all, the wine will be destroyed in verse 12. Therefore, behold, the days come, says Jehovah, that I will send unto him them that pour off, and they shall pour him off, and they shall empty his vessels and break their bottles in pieces. See here again, behold, the days come. Remember what we said about that? Behold, the days come. This is talking about the prophetic future. It's placing it into the prophetic future. I shall send to him those who pull off. They shall empty the bottles. They shall break in pieces. So God is going to send someone to Moab who would metaphorically pour her wine off her lees. However, the pouring was not going to be improving her flavor, because it would be the pouring out of judgment. Second, he points out the shame of Moab in verse 13. Moab shall be ashamed of Chemosh, as the house of Israel was ashamed of Bethel, their confidence. So Moab is going to be ashamed of Chemosh. Now, the day is coming when Moab will be ashamed of her god Chemosh. And then Jeremiah draws a comparison with Israel. Remember, Israel used to worship the golden calf or the golden idol in Bethel. In Bethel, Israel had set up a statue of a golden calf as a substitute for the temple. And over time, the Israelites realized that this statue was incapable of saving the northern kingdom from Assyrian destruction. And when Jeremiah recorded the prophecy of verse 13, the northern kingdom had been in exile for about a century. And Israel had become ashamed of Bethel and of her idolatry with the golden calf. So Jeremiah is drawing a comparison here. He says, just as Israel was ashamed of the golden calf of Bethel, so Moab will become ashamed of her own god Chemosh. Also, we see Bethel was the name of a god in the Elephantine papyri where the Jews settled in Egypt. But it's more likely that we're talking about the golden calf in the northern kingdom of Israel, not that Bethel. Okay, almost there. Now Jeremiah reminds us now of Moab's previous boast in verse 14. How say you, we are mighty men and valiant men for the war? This was Moab's boast. They were so certain of their military abilities that they believed nothing would be able to defeat them. And then the fourth, we see here the results of their boasting are found in verse 15. Moab is laid waste, he had gone up into his cities, and his chosen young men are gone down to the slaughter, says the king, whose name is Jehovah of hosts. So results of Moab's boasting in verse 15 include, first of all, the country being laid waste, and then the enemy soldiers have now gone into the cities, and then these mighty men of verse 14 were unable to stop the enemy from entering their cities. And then third, we see the chosen young men have gone down in the slaughter. So these valiant young men of verse 14 have died by the sword in verse 15. Again, Jeremiah emphasizes that this is a result of God's decree, whose name is Jehovah of hosts. And then we see now in verse 16, declares that disaster would now fall upon Moab. The calamity of Moab is near to come, and his affliction haste fast. So the wording Jeremiah used in this verse is similar to Deuteronomy 32:35, which was not applicable to Moab, but Jeremiah is, in this case, is using it as an application to Moab. Deuteronomy 32:35, vengeance is mine and recompense, at the time when their foot shall slide. Here it is, for the day of their calamity is at hand, and the things that are to come upon them shall make haste. So this is where he's using it. The section regarding Moab's complacency now ends in verse 17 with a description of the nation's mourning. All ye that are round about him bemoan him, and all ye that know his name say, how is the strong staff broken, the beautiful rod? So the surrounding nations, which may have been in alliance with Moab, will lament their fall. If Moab has fallen, then certainly they're also going to fall. And then in the next section, in 18 to 25, Jeremiah will describe the calamity on the cities of Moab. And that's where we're going to finish it today. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.